And then the second one that we'll look at is David. Now, while David was still a teenager, he was anointed by Saul to become the king of Israel. And you read this in 1 Samuel. You find that back in the early part. There's after Judges, you have Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verses 12 and 13. We know that Samuel came to the house of Jesse and asked to see the sons. And they began at the first one and went right through 6 of them. And Samuel said, that's not them. And he said, are there any more? And so Jesse sent and brought him, that's the youngest one, David, in. Now he was ruddy. That means he had a red complexion. He'd be outdoors with the sheep. You know how your skin gets reddened by the wind and the sun? Well, that's what that word means. With beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for he is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went home to Ramah. Well, I don't think this is likely to happen to any of us, that a prophet will come along and anoint us and say we're going to be the whatever, a king or a queen. Imagine, as a teenager, David was anointed and told he'd become the king. But what happened after that? Let's have a look at some events in David's life. Next, he became a musician. As a musician, he was asked to go and play before King Saul. In chapter 18, this is 1 Samuel chapter 18 and verses 21 and 22. No, I think that's wrong. Is it back in 16, should it be? Yes, it should have been. I've written it wrong, sorry. In chapter 16 and 21 and 22. Then David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David now stand before me, for he has found favour in my sight. Now we find that David's a member of the king's household. And I wonder, did he think, this is how I'm going to become the king? I've got a foothold in the king's household now. And he became a favoured member of it. The king, you could say, doted on him. He really liked him. And next we read the account of the battle with Goliath. And one of the prizes for defeating Goliath was to marry the king's daughter. So we know that David defeated Goliath. And we read in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 25, where it says, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel. And it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. That was no taxes. Very nice. Yes. And looking into chapter 18 and verse 2, Saul took David that day and did not let him return to his father's house. David now has been promised that he could marry the king's daughter. But then David becomes a favourite with the people. He becomes a hero in their eyes because of all the battles that he won for Israel. and this makes the king jealous. And he tried to get David killed by putting a difficult task to him to do. But David accomplished that, and we read that he did marry the king's daughter. And I wonder if David thought, well, now, this is God's plan for me. Look, I've married the king's daughter. I'm in his household. It's only one step up from there to become the king. But what happened next? Saul's anger with David grew and grew, and so David was forced to become an outlaw and flee from the presence of the king. And we read that twice David had the opportunity to kill King Saul, but he refused to take matters into his own hand. And I wonder what would be our response in a situation like this. Say, for example, in the workplace, you've been promised a promotion and someone's there at the moment. And the opportunity arises that you can cause that person to be put out. Would you take matters into your own hands so that the promise made to you would come? No. David refused to take matters into his own hand. You wouldn't forget that you'd been anointed to be king of Israel when it happened to you. He didn't forget, but he didn't take matters into his own hand, but rather waited for God's timing to bring it about. David trusted and believed that God would do what he had promised. He worked at it, and he really would have had to work at it all those years that he was in the wilderness as an outcast with a band of rough and probably unpleasant men. But after many more years and many trials, we read that David did become the king of Israel. And he became the king when he was 30 years old. And he reigned for 40 years. But turn to Psalm 27 and look at verses 13 and 14. Something that David wrote. Psalm 27 and verses 13 and 14, where he says, I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. And that's what David was prepared to do. He would have despaired. He could have despaired that it would have ever come to pass. But he knew, it says he believed that God would bring to pass that which he promised. So where are you today? What sort of place are you in? Has God promised you something and it's not coming to pass? You know, I can have a personal testimony about that. It was in 1972. I believed God made me a promise about a healing in our family from the Lord. And the promise was that this was the work of God, that it might bring glory to God in that. It was the work of God, and I had to trust him because it was 30 years later before that happened. It was in 2002 that I saw the answer to that, to the promise that God had given me all those years before. And that's what it says, that the work of God might be his glory and in his work and his time. You see, God's timing is worth waiting for. If we try to take it in our own hands, we'll just make a mess of it. A disastrous mess of it, which is what happened with Abraham. because through Ishmael has come all the tribes of Arab and where a lot of the unrest in the Middle East is today has come through that mistake of Abraham. We need to wait on God's timing and not fall into unbelief. And it is work to hold on to trusting and believing in Him. It's something that we have to keep practicing day by day, all the time. To know Him whom we believe in. Yeah.